Hey friends, tonight we're cracking open the Indus Valley Civilization. And I mean that literally, because Victorian scientists literally measured skull circumferences like they were shopping for melons at a farmer's market, except the melons were dead people. The market was institutionalized racism wearing a lab coat. You're about to step into a world where ancient toilets put your plumbing to shame, where every artifact sparks a decade-long academic brawl, and where the supposedly primitive Bronze Age city dwellers had better urban planning than wherever you currently live. Fair warning. You probably won't survive this emotionally intact, especially when you realize a civilization that vanished 4,000 years ago was more organized than your local DMV. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Please drop a comment with where you're watching from and what ungodly hour it is in your time zone. Bonus points if you're watching this while pretending to work. We've all been there. Now grab snacks, mute your mom, and let's get weird together. You're standing in a dusty British museum basement in 1921, and the air smells like formaldehyde, colonial entitlement, and mothballs that have somehow gained sentience during the Boer War. On the table in front of you sits a human skull, Bronze Age, excavated from Mohenjo-Daro, and about to have the worst day of its afterlife. Enter the phrenologists. Scientists who genuinely believed they could determine intelligence, morality, and racial hierarchy by fondling craniums with calipers like they're tuning a piano. Except the piano is dead, the music is racism, and the concert hall is the entire British Empire. These guys measured everything. Cranial capacity, nasal index, orbital breadth. If it had a Latin name and could be weaponized to justify colonialism, they were all over it. The mainstream historical fact is that Victorian anthropology was preoccupied with physical anthropology and racial classification, employing pseudoscientific methods to rank human populations on invented hierarchies. They'd measure skull dimensions, compare them to European norms, and then conclude, shockingly, that white Europeans were the pinnacle of human evolution. It's like grading your own homework and giving yourself an A+ for being born. The Indus Valley skeletons didn't fit neatly into their race charts. Some skulls were dolichocephalic, long-headed, while others were brachycephalic, round-headed, and the measurements varied significantly, much like a drunk person playing darts. Historians still debate whether the Indus Valley population was ethnically homogeneous or a melting pot of migrant groups. Still, honestly, the Victorians' arguments were conducted in such breathtakingly bad faith that their conclusions have aged like seafood left in a hot car. They wanted so desperately to prove that Aryans invaded and civilized the region. Spoiler alert, that theory is now deader than the skulls they measured, that they twisted every data point into a pretzel of confirmation bias. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some British researchers became so obsessed with skull measurements that they'd literally steal remains from excavation sites, ship them back to England in crates labeled pottery fragments, and add them to private collections, much like macabre Pokemon cards. Gotta catch 'em all. But make it grave robbery with academic credentials. Museums across Europe are still repatriating human remains that were yoinked during this era, and every apology letter is basically, oops, sorry we treated your ancestors like decorative bookends for 100 years, our bad. You run your, hypothetical, fingers along a caliper, and the brass is cold, heavier than you expected, with hinges that squeak like they're protesting their own existence. The irony is thick enough to choke on. These instruments were precision tools used for wildly imprecise, scientifically bankrupt conclusions. Phrenology, the study of skull bumps to determine personality, was already being debunked by actual neurologists, but that didn't stop colonial anthropologists from using it as a greatest hits reference guide. They'd find a bump here, a depression there, and declare the owner was prone to servitude or lacking in cognitive capacity. It's astrology for racists, except astrology is harmless fun, and this ruined millions of lives. The measurements got recorded in leather-bound ledgers with the kind of meticulous penmanship that makes you think the writer definitely owned a monocle. Columns for skull length, skull width, cephalic index, and then, because subtlety is for quitters, columns labeled race and remarks. The remarks are precisely as nasty as you're imagining. Negroid features, evidence of Dravidian stock, inferior cranial development. Every entry is a minor hate crime in cursive. Modern archaeologists examine these records and experience a full-body cringe. the kind where your soul tries to escape through your spine. The data is useless, not because the measurements were inaccurate, though many were, but because the entire framework was garbage. It's like building a skyscraper on a foundation of cotton candy and vibes. Contemporary scholars debate whether we should even reference this early research or discard it altogether and start anew, and honestly, both options have merit. But here's the twist that'll make you uncomfortable at parties. Those flawed, racist expeditions did uncover the Indus Valley Civilization and bring it to global attention. Without the colonial archaeological projects, however compromised by bigotry, we might still not know Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro existed. It's the worst version of credit where credit's due. Like thanking a burglar for revealing your house has a security problem. The artifacts they cataloged, the sites they excavated, the photographs they took, all tainted by ideology, all still foundational to current research. You can't untangle the discovery from the awfulness of how it was discovered. And that tension keeps academics up at night, stress-eating crackers over journal articles. So you stand there, in that imaginary museum basement, holding calipers designed to prove a lie, staring at a skull that belonged to someone who lived in a city with better sewage infrastructure than most medieval European capitals. The phrenologists thought they were documenting evolutionary hierarchy. They were actually fondling bones while the ghosts of Harappan urban planners laughed at their unwashed Victorian asses. You leave the skull-fondling Victorian nightmare behind and stumble directly into the burial pits of Harappa, where the dead are crammed into positions that make you wonder if the ancient funeral directors were working on commission or just really bad at spatial reasoning. The ground beneath your feet is packed earth mixed with pottery shards. When you crouch down to peer into an excavated grave, the smell hits you. 4,500 years of compressed dirt, trace minerals, and the faint metallic ghost of decomposition that never entirely leaves burial sites. It's like opening a Tupperware container you forgot in the back of the fridge. Except the leftovers are human remains and nobody's apologizing. The Indus Valley Civilization didn't practice death rites like its Bronze Age neighbors. While Egypt was building pyramids that could be seen from space and Mesopotamia was burying kings with entire murdered retinues, Harappans were just eating bodies into simple pits with a pottery bowl and maybe some beads if you were lucky. The mainstream fact here is that Indus Valley burial practices were remarkably egalitarian and minimalist compared to contemporary civilizations. No massive tombs, no treasure hoards, no architectural flair to assert dominance over the afterlife. Just you, a hole in the ground, and the vague hope that someone remembered to put your head facing north. But here's where it gets weird. You're staring at a burial jar, a massive ceramic vessel, and inside it is a human skeleton folded like origami designed by someone who failed geometry. Knees to chest, arms wrapped around shins, head tilted at an angle that would make a chiropractor weep. This is a form of fractional burial, and it is found at multiple Indus sites. Bodies are crammed into jars, sometimes those of adults and children, positioned as if they're trying to win a game of human Tetris. Historians still argue whether this was a sacred religious practice symbolizing rebirth from a womb-like vessel, or just the Bronze Age equivalent of, "We don't have room for a full grave. Make it work." The debate has lasted decades, and frankly, both sides are just guessing with academic credentials. Your fingers trace the rim of a burial jar, and the ceramic is rough, unglazed, with visible coil marks from where the potter built it up layer by layer. Someone made this knowing it would hold a corpse. That was the entire job description. Pottery maker needed. Must be comfortable with death, tight deadlines, and fitting full-grown humans into containers designed for grain storage. Benefits? None. Existential dread? Guaranteed. Here's your quirky tidbit. At the cemetery of Rakagari, archaeologists found graves where bodies were buried with their feet deliberately removed and placed elsewhere in the burial. Not hacked off post-mortem in a violent way, but carefully separated, like someone was following a recipe that said, Step 4, detach feet, set aside. Nobody knows why. Some researchers speculate it was symbolic, preventing the dead from walking back, maybe? But that's just academic fan fiction. The feet are gone, the reason is gone, and somewhere in the afterlife, a Harappan is probably hopping around very confused and mildly annoyed. You move through the cemetery rows, and the graves are disturbingly uniform. Extended burials, mostly. Bodies laid out on their backs, hands at their sides or folded across the chest, all aligned north-south. A few have pottery vessels near their heads, possibly for food or water in the afterlife. Some still wear copper bangles, their metal oxidized to a gorgeous green patina that says, "I've been here longer than your family tree." But there's no hierarchy, no royal tomb dripping with gold. No evidence suggests that some people received VIP afterlife treatment while others received the economy package. It's almost boring. It is boring in a way that fundamentally challenges our understanding of how Bronze Age societies functioned. Mesopotamian kings got buried with hundreds of sacrificed attendants. Servants, musicians, guards, all poisoned or stabbed to serve in the next world, which is both horrifying and the worst possible employee retention strategy. Egyptian pharaohs were mummified, wrapped and tombed, and often surrounded by enough furniture to stock an IKEA. The Indus Valley? Here's a pot. Good luck. It's the minimalist Scandinavian design aesthetic of ancient death rituals, except Marie Kondo would at least let you keep some stuff that sparks joy. The lack of grave goods drives archaeologists absolutely feral. We love grave goods. They tell us about wealth, trade, social status, and religious beliefs. They're basically ancient people's Pinterest boards. But Harappan burials are stingy. A few beads here, a shell bangle there, maybe a tiny bronze mirror if you were fancy. Nothing that screams, "I was important." Nothing that helps us reconstruct their cosmology or eschatology. It's like they died and thought, yeah, I'm not taking anything with me, and also I'm not making it easy for future archaeologists. Suffer. Some graves contain multiple bodies, family plots, maybe, or plague victims buried together when there wasn't time for individual funerals. You crouch next to one. An adult and two small children, bones jumbled together after millennia of soil shift. The children's skeletons are so small and fragile, their ribs resembling bird bones. Infant mortality in the Bronze Age was catastrophic. Estimates suggest 40 to 50% of children died before age 5 from disease, malnutrition, and infections we'd now cure with a single antibiotic. Every cemetery is a monument to how much it sucked to be a baby before modern medicine, and this one's no different. You find a burial with a skull that's been trepanned, a hole drilled into the cranium, the edges showing signs of healing, meaning the person survived the procedure. Someone took a drill, probably a bow drill with a stone or bronze bit, and bored into a living person's skull, possibly to relieve pressure from an injury, perhaps to release evil spirits. Probably because Bronze Age medicine was 10% observation and 90% vibes. The fact that it healed means the patient lived weeks or months afterward, walking around with a hole in their head, probably telling everyone at parties, "Yeah, this one time I let a guy drill my skull. No big deal." Historians still debate whether Indus burial practices reflect a genuinely egalitarian society or whether they have yet to discover the elite cemeteries. Maybe the rulers got cremated and scattered, leaving no trace. Perhaps they were buried somewhere we haven't excavated, under a modern city, possibly, paved over by history's cruel indifference. Or maybe, just maybe, the Indus Valley was actually more equal than other Bronze Age civilizations, and that breaks our brains because we're accustomed to ancient history being a parade of kings, enslaved people, and violent hierarchies. You stand, brush the dirt from your knees. It clings stubbornly, mixing with your sweat in the brutal subcontinental heat, and look across the necropolis. Simple graves, simple people, complicated questions. Somewhere beneath your feet, thousands more bodies wait, folded into jars or stretched in the earth, holding secrets in their marrow that isotope analysis and DNA sequencing are only beginning to crack. You lean closer to the bones, and that's when you notice the skull isn't quite right. There's a depression above the left eye socket, a healed fracture, where the bone has remodeled around the injury site, much like scar tissue made of calcium. Someone clocked this person hard enough to crack their skull, and they lived through it long enough for the bone to knit back together in a lumpy, asymmetrical mess. You're looking at ancient violence frozen in skeletal form, and it's weirdly intimate, like reading someone's diary, except the diary is their literal structural damage and you can't stop staring. The Indus Valley Civilization has a reputation for being peaceful, the Coachella of Bronze Age societies, characterized by all good vibes and urban planning, with no weapons or warfare, just people making beads and taking baths. And compared to their neighbors, that's partially true. The mainstream historical fact is that Indus Valley sites exhibit significantly less evidence of organized warfare than contemporary civilizations, such as Mesopotamia or Egypt. No mass graves full of weapon injuries. No fortification walls designed to repel armies. No palace reliefs showing kings trampling enemies like they're collecting Pokemon badges of conquest. The archaeological record suggests a society that resolved conflicts through means other than physical violence, such as hitting each other with progressively larger bronze objects. But less warfare doesn't mean zero violence. And the bones snitch. You move through the skeletal remains laid out for analysis, and the injuries pile up like a greatest hits compilation of ways humans hurt each other when armies aren't involved. Fractured ulnas from defensive wounds, the "I'm raising my arm to block someone trying to cave my face" in classic. Healed rib fractures that suggest blunt force trauma, possibly from falling off a roof during construction, possibly from a domestic dispute that got out of hand, possibly from an argument about pottery designs that escalated way beyond what anyone intended. Historians still argue whether the violence patterns indicate systematic interpersonal conflict or just the normal background radiation of injuries that happen when humans do human things like build cities and occasionally get mad at each other. The debate is hilariously polite, like scholars are afraid to admit that even peaceful ancient people definitely threw hands sometimes. Here's what makes you uncomfortable. The gender distribution. Several female skeletons show healed fractures consistent with intimate partner violence. Forearm breaks from defending against blows, facial fractures, and rib injuries. It's the same pattern forensic anthropologists see in modern domestic abuse cases, and the consistency across 4,500 years is grim. Bronze Age or contemporary, some things don't change, and that realization sits in your stomach like spoiled meat. You're looking at evidence that multiple someones, lived with the threat of violence in their own homes, and there's no written record to tell you if anyone helped them, if there were social structures to intervene, if they had any recourse at all. Your quirky tidbit arrives via a skull from Harappa. A perfectly circular hole, punched clean through the frontal bone, with beveled edges that indicate the blow came from outside in. Not trepanation, the edges are wrong, too irregular, and there's no sign of healing. This person took something pointy to the forehead and died, probably quickly, possibly surprised, definitely unhappy about it. The archaeologist who initially found it suggested that it was a weapon, but no metal artifacts match the wound pattern. Current speculation includes a heavy-duty spindle whorl, the weighted disc used for spinning thread, swung with murderous intent, because nothing says Bronze Age crime scene like being killed by a textile tool. Imagine explaining that in the afterlife. How'd you die? Susan clocked me with her yarn equipment during an argument about weaving patterns. You catalog more injuries. A femur with a poorly healed spiral fracture, the kind you get from rotational force, like getting your leg caught in a collapse or twisted in a fall. The bone set crooked, no professional medical intervention, just time and luck, and probably screaming pain every winter when the weather changed. A cervical vertebra with compression damage, consistent with a heavy load carried on the head for years, the spine is gradually deforming under the weight. This is occupational hazard territory. The physical cost of moving bricks, hauling water, and transporting trade goods in a civilization without wheeled carts. Yes, they had wheels for pottery, but apparently they didn't vibe with vehicles, which is its own fascinating weirdness. Child skeletons exhibit nutritional stress markers, enamel hypoplasia and parodic hyperostosis, indicating periods when food was scarce, causing their growing bodies to deplete themselves from the inside out, leaching minerals from their bones to sustain vital organs. It's not violence in the someone hit you sense, but it's structural violence, the kind where your environment and economy conspire to stunt your growth and probably kill you before adulthood. The bones don't care about philosophical distinctions. They just record deprivation in layers like tree rings of suffering. There's a jaw with an abscess so massive the infection eroded through the bone, leaving a hole you could stick your pinky through. Dental infections in the Bronze Age were a leading cause of death, because antibiotics wouldn't be invented for another 4,000 years, and the pain management options were chew on some herbs and pray, or die. This person probably spent their last weeks in absolute agony, the infection spreading through their jaw, into their bloodstream, their face swollen like a balloon full of pus, fever cooking their brain. And somewhere, a hairpan dentist equivalent was just like, "Have you tried not having an infected tooth? That might help." Some skeletons show no trauma. Perfect bones, symmetrical, well-mineralized, no breaks, no infections, no drama. These people lived quiet lives, or at least, their violence was soft tissue only, the kind that doesn't leave marks on bones. Strangulation, poisoning, stabbing that missed the skeleton, psychological abuse. The skeleton is a limited narrator. It only tells you what happened to calcium and phosphate, not what happened to the person. You find a toe bone, a tiny phalanx with a crush injury. Someone dropped something heavy on their foot 4,500 years ago, and you feel that in your soul. That's the most relatable injury in the entire cemetery. Not warfare, not domestic violence, not occupational hazard, just clumsiness, the eternal human condition. You imagine them hopping around, swearing in Proto-Dravidian or whatever language they spoke, while their friends laughed because some things are funny across all of human history. Historians still debate whether the relative lack of weapons indicates that the Harappans were pacifists or fought differently, perhaps with wooden clubs that didn't preserve, or perhaps with social sanctions rather than physical force. But the bones suggest a society that was peaceful in the sense that they didn't wage organized war, not in the sense that nobody ever got hurt. It's peaceful, like your family's Thanksgiving. No armies invading, but definitely some simmering tensions and the occasional plate thrown in the kitchen when nobody's watching. You dust off your hands and step back from the bones, back into the city itself, and that's when the absence hits you like a slap. You're walking through Mohenjo-Daro, one of the largest cities of the Bronze Age world, home to maybe 40,000 people at its peak, and there are no weapons. No armory packed with spears. No cache of bronze swords tucked in a palace basement. No artistic reliefs depicting glorious battle scenes, where the king shoots arrows from a chariot while enemies die in a photogenic manner. It's like arriving at a medieval castle and discovering that they've replaced the armory with a wellness center and a community garden. Your brain keeps looking for the military infrastructure, and it's just not there, and the cognitive dissonance makes you feel like you're reading a book with pages missing. The mainstream historical fact is that Indus Valley sites show virtually no evidence of military organization, standing armies, or defensive architecture. Archaeologists have excavated multiple major cities, Harappa, Mohenjo-Daro, Dhalavira, Rakhigarhi, and found exactly zero fortification walls, no bastions, no watchtowers, no moats, no murder holes in gateways where defenders could pour boiling oil on invaders. The citadels that early archaeologists got excited about? Probably just raised platforms to escape flooding, not military strongholds. It's the architectural equivalent of wearing a raincoat and having everyone assume you're preparing for chemical warfare. You walk the perimeter of the city, and the walls are flood barriers. Boring, practical, hydrological engineering designed to keep the Indus River from drowning everyone's ground floor toilets, not to repel invading armies. They're thick and impressive, sure, but they're positioned wrong for defense, with no battlements, no arrow slits, no design features that say, "We expect violence from outside." It's like building a hurricane-proof house in Florida and having archaeologists 4,000 years later conclude you were preparing for siege warfare against the ocean. The streets are narrow and winding, nightmare fuel for anyone trying to move troops efficiently, but perfect for shade and cooling breezes in a climate that regularly hits 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The city layout prioritizes air circulation and sanitation, not strategic choke points and killing fields. There's no central palace complex where a king would coordinate military campaigns, no grand plaza for mustering soldiers, no weapons manufacturing district pumping out spears like an ancient assembly line. Instead, there are bead workshops, pottery kilns, dye vats, and an obscene number of bathrooms. It's like the entire civilization looked at Bronze Age militarism and said, "No thanks, we're going to focus on hygiene and international trade." Here's your quirky tidbit that makes archaeologists lose their minds. When the British first excavated Mohenjo-Daro in the 1920s, they were so convinced they'd find weapons that they misidentified certain artifacts. A ceremonial mace head? Clearly a weapon. A copper axe designed for woodworking? Battle axe, obviously. A pointy thing that was probably for leatherworking? Dagger, no question. Modern analysis has reclassified almost all of these as tools. The axes are wrong-weighted for combat. The daggers are too fragile for stabbing humans, though they'd work fine on leather or rope, and the mace was probably a prestige object or symbolic tool, not something you'd actually bonk someone with. The British literally saw what they expected to see because a civilization without weapons didn't fit their worldview, and the cognitive bias is so thick you could cut it with one of those misidentified battle axes. You pick up one of the copper weapons, a flat axe head with a blade that's maybe 3 inches long. It weighs almost nothing. The edge is dull. You could maybe threaten someone with it if they were very polite and willing to stand still, but in actual combat you'd be better off throwing a brick or just running away. It's a tool designed for craft work, and conflating every sharp object with warfare is the archaeological equivalent of assuming everyone who owns a kitchen knife is planning a murder. Historians still debate whether the Indus Valley Civilization was genuinely pacifist, organized around trade and cooperation rather than conquest, or whether the evidence is simply missing. Maybe they fought with wooden weapons that rotted away. Perhaps they had a professional warrior class that got cremated with their gear, leaving no archaeological trace. Perhaps the real weapons are buried under modern cities like Karachi or Delhi, forever inaccessible beneath shopping malls and subway lines. The debate has raged for decades, and both sides have valid points. However, they essentially acknowledge that we don't actually know. We're just guessing with footnotes. The absence of military art is equally baffling. Mesopotamian palaces are adorned with reliefs of kings impaling their enemies. Egyptians painted tomb walls with battle scenes, where pharaohs are depicted as 10 feet tall and enemies are tiny and pathetic. It's ancient propaganda, the "I'm very badass" energy of the Bronze Age. The Indus Valley? The art features seals depicting bulls, unicorns, unusual ritual scenes, and what may be a deity sitting cross-legged. No violence, no conquest, no king standing on a pile of corpses looking pleased with himself. It's like they collectively decided warfare wasn't aesthetically interesting, which is either remarkably enlightened or frustratingly unhelpful for archaeologists trying to understand their political structure. You stand in what might be a granary, or a public hall, or a mysterious building that everyone argues about because it doesn't fit any template. The floor is smooth brick, worn by thousands of feet, and you imagine it packed with people. Doing what? Trading? Voting? Resolving disputes through heated debate and sarcastic commentary? There's no throne, no royal dais, no obvious power center. The architecture suggests collective decision-making or distributed authority, which sounds great until you realize it means we have no idea who actually ran things. Some scholars propose the Indus Valley was a theocracy run by priest-kings. We'll get to why that's probably wrong later. Buckle up. Others suggest it was a republic or oligarchy, governed by merchant councils or guilds. A few fringe theorists, the kind who get yelled at conferences, propose it was essentially anarchist with minimal centralized authority and maximum local autonomy, which would make it the most politically radical Bronze Age civilization and also conveniently impossible to prove or disprove. Everyone's just throwing darts at a board while the actual hairpans laugh from the afterlife. The lack of weapons doesn't mean the absence of conflict, you just catalog the bone trauma to prove it. But it does mean something different was happening here. Maybe violence was stigmatized, kept private, handled through social mechanisms rather than state-sponsored armies. Perhaps they were exceptionally skilled in trade and diplomacy, securing what they needed through commerce rather than conquest. Or maybe, and this is the option that haunts archaeologists, we're looking at an entire civilization through such a distorted lens that we're missing something obvious, something that would make it all click into place. You step out of the mysterious maybe granary and immediately need to pee, which is perfect timing because you're about to confront the most simultaneously impressive and humiliating aspect of Indus Valley life. Their toilets were better than yours. Not metaphorically. Not pretty good for ancient times. Straight up better. You walk into a typical hairpan house. Compact, multi-story, brick construction, and there it is. A dedicated bathroom with a toilet seat, a drainage chute, and a system that connects to covered sewers running under the street. It's 2600 BCE. Your apartment building in the 21st century has pipes that leak, drains that clog, and a landlord who responds to maintenance requests with the urgency of continental drift. The Bronze Age is dunking on you through the medium of sanitation infrastructure. The mainstream historical fact is that the Indus Valley Civilization had the most sophisticated urban drainage and sanitation system of any Bronze Age society, possibly of any pre-Roman civilization period. Nearly every house had a private bathroom with a sit-down toilet connected to an elaborate network of covered drains, soak pits, and sewers. We're not talking about chamber pots dumped into the street, looking at you, medieval Europe, or communal latrines where you squat next to strangers while contemplating mortality. Sorry, Rome. We're talking about individual, private, plumbed bathrooms in residential homes. The Indus Valley invented ensuite facilities 4,500 years ago, and modern city planners still can't guarantee you won't have to share a bathroom with 3 roommates. You crouch next to a toilet, just a U-shaped brick seat, really with a hole that drops into a vertical chute. Below that, a cesspit lined with brick and pottery shards to aid drainage. Waste falls through the chute. Liquids percolate through the pottery-lined pit into the soil. Solids accumulate and are probably cleaned out periodically by someone with the worst job in Harappa. Imagine that occupation. What do? I shovel shit out of brick pits so the city doesn't drown in sewage. Wow. That sounds essential, but also like you can never fully wash your hands. The fact that someone did that job systematically for centuries is proof that the Indus Valley Civilization understood that civic infrastructure requires collective sacrifice and probably decent compensation for the truly arduous tasks. The drains are works of art. You follow one from a bathroom down through the wall, there's literally a pottery pipe embedded in the brick, and out into the street where it joins a covered channel. The channel runs along the street, lined with brick, and features removable stone slabs on top, allowing maintenance workers to access clogs. Someone designed this. Someone thought, we need regular access for cleaning, so let's make it modular. It's so practical, so well engineered, that you want to cry when you remember that modern cities still have sewers that explode and flood neighborhoods because nobody budgeted for maintenance. Here's your quirky tidbit. At Lothal, a port city, archaeologists found toilets on the ground floor connected to drains that ran directly into the street system, which is normal. However, they also found evidence of toilets on the second floors, with vertical pipes running through the walls, multi-story plumbing. The engineering required to make that work, the water pressure calculations, the structural integrity of pipes embedded in brick walls, the slope calculations for drainage is college-level stuff. These people made their way upstairs to the bathrooms using Bronze Age technology, and you can't even get your shower to maintain a consistent temperature. The streets themselves are designed around drainage. They're not straight Roman roads optimized for legions marching. They're slightly winding, sloped carefully to direct water flow, with the drains running alongside or down the middle. When it rained, and during monsoon season it poured, the water ran exactly where the city planners intended, into channels, out to soakage areas beyond the city limits. No random flooding, no streets turning into rivers, just functional hydrology that would make modern civil engineers weep with envy. You notice the bathrooms are always positioned on the street-facing side of houses, which seems weird until you realize it's genius. Maintenance and cleaning required access to the drains, and if your toilet were in the middle of your house, workers would have to tromp through your living room to fix problems. Street-side placement means they access everything from outside, your privacy stays intact, and the whole system is modular and serviceable. It's a user interface design applied to Bronze Age plumbing. Historians still debate whether the obsession with bathing and drainage was purely practical, aimed at disease prevention and heat management in a brutal climate, or deeply rooted in religion. Water and purity are huge in later South Asian religions. Hinduism, Jainism, and Buddhism all have ritual bathing, and some scholars think the Indus Valley's bathroom fixation was proto-religious behavior, ritual cleansing as a daily practice. Others believe that's projecting later beliefs backward, and the Harappans just liked being clean because being filthy in 120-degree heat with limited medicine is an express ticket to dying of something preventable. The debate is basically, were they spiritual or just smart? And honestly, maybe they were both. Maybe hygiene doesn't need a metaphysical justification when cholera exists. Some houses have bathing platforms, raised brick areas with drainage, where you'd stand and pour water over yourself from a jar. It's not a shower in the modern sense, but it shares the same concept. A dedicated space for getting clean, with water flowing away through intentional channels instead of simply pooling on the floor. The brick floors are slightly sloped, nothing dramatic, maybe a 2-degree angle, so water always flows toward the drain. Whoever designed this understood gravity, geometry, and the fact that standing in your own dirty bathwater is miserable. The soak pits are lined with broken pottery, sherds deliberately placed to create a permeable layer that filters liquids while trapping solids. It's low-tech but effective, essentially a precursor to modern septic systems. Modern, eco-friendly greywater systems use the same principle, percolation through aggregate material, and charge you thousands of dollars for the privilege. The Harappans were doing it because it worked, and they had no other options. You stand up, brush brick dust off your knees, and look down the street where the drain covers line up like tiles in a particularly boring video game. Every house, every workshop, every public building, all connected, all draining, all part of a system that required citywide planning and cooperation. You can't build this piecemeal. You can't have half the city plumbed and half dumping waste in the street. It only works if everyone participates, which means centralized planning, enforced building codes, and a population that agrees toilets are non-negotiable. The fact that this system was maintained for centuries, repaired when damaged, and expanded as cities grew indicates that the Indus Valley Civilization valued infrastructure over monuments. Other civilizations built pyramids and palaces. Harappans built sewers. And honestly, the sewers were more useful. You're standing in front of a tiny square seal, maybe an inch across, carved from steatite stone, and on it are symbols that have driven linguists to academic violence for the past century. 5 characters, crisp and clear, arranged right to left, or maybe left to right. Nobody's sure, hovering above an engraved bull. The symbols look almost familiar, like you should be able to read them like they're on the tip of your brain's tongue. But they're not. They're gibberish, beautiful, tantalizing, infuriating gibberish. The Indus script is the ultimate tease. 400+ distinct symbols, thousands of inscriptions, found on seals, pottery, metal objects, even a wooden signboard, and exactly 0% of it is definitively translated. It's a linguistic haunted house where every door leads to another theory, and all the theorists are fist-fighting in the hallways. The mainstream historical fact is that the Indus Valley script remains undeciphered despite over 90 years of serious scholarly effort. We have roughly 4,000 to 5,000 inscribed objects, most of which are seals used for trade and administration. The texts are frustratingly short. The average inscription is 5 symbols long, with the longest being perhaps 17. You can't crack a language with nothing but Twitter-length samples, especially when you don't have a bilingual text like the Rosetta Stone that would let you cheat off someone else's homework. It's like trying to learn Mandarin from fortune cookies and license plates. Technically, you're seeing the language, but you're learning nothing. You run your thumb over the carved symbols. Fish, jar, plant-looking thing, crosshatch square. Something that might be a person or a pole or someone's doodle of a really boring ladder. The stone is smooth, the carving precise, the product of a craftsperson who did this hundreds of times. These seals were mass-produced and distributed across a trade network that stretched from Afghanistan to Gujarat, used for stamping clay tags on goods, marking ownership, and possibly certifying quality. The symbols meant something specific, something standardized enough that people hundreds of miles apart could look at a seal and understand its message. And now, we're just making shit up and calling it peer-reviewed research. Here's the quirky tidbit that should tell you how desperate linguists are. Someone tried to decode the script using dolphin communication patterns. I'm not joking. In the 1960s, a researcher observed that the distribution of symbols exhibited similar statistical properties to those of dolphin whistles and concluded that the Indus script might encode a tonal language. The paper was published. People cited it. It took decades for the field to collectively say, hey, maybe comparing Bronze Age humans to dolphins isn't rigorous methodology. And by then the damage was done. Every crank theory since has used that paper as proof that academic journals will publish literally anything if it sounds sciencey enough. The theories multiply like bacteria in a petri dish. Some scholars believe it's Proto-Dravidian, the ancestor of languages such as Tamil and Telugu, which would make sense both geographically and culturally. They've produced translations that map symbols to Dravidian words, and the results sound plausible until you realize they're cherry-picking which symbols mean what based on desired outcomes. It's the linguistic equivalent of horoscopes, vague enough to seem right, specific enough to feel meaningful, ultimately unfalsifiable. Other researchers claim it's a Vedic language, early Sanskrit, or something related, which would align with later Hindu texts and make certain nationalist groups very happy. These translations are even more suspect because the political motivations are as apparent as a bra strap in a poorly fitted dress. When your decipherment coincidentally supports your modern political narrative, linguists get skeptical. Funny how that works. A particularly spicy faction argues the Indus script isn't language at all. It's just symbols like logos or religious iconography, never representing speech. This theory, published in 2004, caused an academic meltdown so spectacular that scholars were writing response papers with titles that were basically academic trash talk. The collapse of the Indus script thesis got countered with statistical analysis proves linguistic structure, which got countered with your statistical analysis is bad and you should feel bad. I'm paraphrasing, but barely. Historians still debate whether the symbol system constitutes actual writing or elaborate pictograms, and both sides present data, with each side accusing the other of methodological malpractice, resulting in beautiful chaos. You pick up another seal. Elephant symbol, 3 vertical lines, a U-shape. What does it mean? Property of the elephant clan? 3 jars of olive oil, certified fresh? Gary was here, 2600 BCE? Nobody knows. The symbols repeat across seals in different combinations, which suggests grammar or syntax. You can't just randomly arrange letters and get meaning. Languages have rules. But without knowing what any individual symbol represents, identifying the rules is like trying to solve a Rubik's Cube in the dark while wearing oven mitts. Some symbols appear only at the beginning of texts. In contrast, others occur only at the end, suggesting they're prefixes or suffixes or determinatives. Symbols that aren't pronounced but clarify meaning, such as hieroglyphic determinatives. That's progress, technically. But it's progress like, I've determined this mystery liquid is wet. Cool, what else you got? The fish symbol is everywhere, on about 20% of all inscribed objects, and some researchers think it represents a sound. Others think it's a word for fish, or ruler, or star, because the word for fish in Dravidian languages sometimes sounds like the word for star. And maybe the symbol does double duty, or perhaps we're all losing our minds. One scholar spent 40 years convinced the fish meant chieftain, and published a book-length decipherment based on that assumption. The book is now a cautionary tale in what happens when you commit to a bad premise and refuse to pivot. The directional ambiguity makes you want to scream. Most seals were carved in mirror image because they were stamped into clay and then reversed, so they're meant to be read in the impressed version, not the carved version. But we don't always have the impressions. We have the seals. Are we reading them backward? Some texts run right to left, others left to right, and a few are boustrophédon, alternating direction line by line, like an ox plowing a field. It's drunk driving for literacy. Computer analysis has helped linguists feed thousands of symbol sequences into algorithms that identify patterns humans might miss. The results confirm the presence of structure, repetition, and rule-governed combinations, all hallmarks of language. But structure isn't translation. You can prove something is a code without cracking it, which is where we've been stuck for decades. You leave the undeciphered symbols behind and walk straight into a museum case containing the most controversial 4 inches in archaeology. It's a bronze statue, a girl, naked except for a frankly absurd number of bangles stacked up her left arm from wrist to shoulder, standing in a pose that has launched 1,000 academic papers and approximately 0 definitive conclusions. She's leaning on one leg, hand on her hip, head tilted slightly, and depending on who you ask, she's either mid-dance move, supremely confident, or just standing there. At the same time, some Victorian archaeologists projected their entire fantasy about exotic dancing girls onto a Bronze Age figurine. Meet the dancing girl of Mohenjo-Daro. Proof that a statue more miniature than your phone can cause academic blood feuds that last generations. The mainstream historical fact is that this bronze sculpture, discovered in 1926, is one of only 2 major bronze figurines recovered from Mohenjo-Daro, and has become an iconic symbol of Indus Valley art, despite being so small that you could easily lose it in a junk drawer. She's 10.5 centimeters tall, just over 4 inches, cast using the lost wax method, where a wax model is carved, encased in clay, and then melted out, allowing molten bronze to be poured in. It's technically sophisticated, artistically confident, and historically invaluable. It has also been the center of debates about race, colonialism, artistic interpretation, and whether archaeologists should be allowed to name things after their own personal projections. You lean close to the glass, and the first thing that hits you is how modern she looks. The pose is naturalistic, almost casual, weight shifted to one hip, arm bent, the stance of someone comfortable in their body. Bronze Age art is typically stiff, formal, and symbolic. Think of Egyptian statues standing at attention for eternity or Mesopotamian figures with their hands clasped in perpetual prayer. This girl looks like she's about to tell you a secret or ask if you've seen her other sandal. The art historians who first encountered her were essentially stumped because she didn't fit any existing template for ancient sculpture. But here's where it gets messy. The British archaeologist who found her, John Marshall, took one look and decided she was a dancing girl, probably a temple dancer or entertainer, definitely part of some exotic performance tradition. He wrote descriptions dripping with colonial fantasy, talking about her racial type, her vivacious pose, making comparisons to contemporary tribal dancers in India in a way that was racist then and aged like milk in the Sahara. He saw a naked bronze girl, and his brain went straight to entertainment and exoticism, because apparently Victorian men had exactly one setting when confronted with unclothed female bodies from non-European cultures. Here's your quirky tidbit that perfectly encapsulates the insanity. Early scholars argued about her ethnicity based on her nose and lips. They measured the figurine's facial features on a statue the size of a Red Bull can and concluded she represented Proto-Australoid or Negrito features, which were racist pseudoscientific categories that should never have existed. Different scholars perceived different racial types in the same 4-inch bronze face, demonstrating that they were bringing their own biases and flawed anthropology to the analysis. It's phrenology's extended universe, now applied to art objects with the same scientific rigor as reading tea leaves. The dancing part? Completely speculative. She's not mid-leap. There's no movement frozen in bronze, no props or context that scream dance performance. She's just standing with an attitude. Historians still debate whether she represents a dancer, a regular person, a deity, a portrait of a specific individual, or simply an artist's study of the human form. The debate reveals more about our assumptions than about her. We want her to be dancing because dancing girl sounds exotic and interesting, and it fits narratives about ancient temple dancers. Still, she might just be girl standing there looking unbothered by your opinions. You notice the bangles, 25 on her left arm, stacked from wrist to shoulder, and none on her right. Each one is individually carved, detailed, and probably represents actual jewelry styles worn in Harappa. The attention to detail is wild. The artist cared enough to render every single bracelet but left the rest of her naked, which suggests the bangles were the point, the status symbol, the identifier. Perhaps she's not a dancer. Maybe she's the daughter of a bangle merchant, modeled to showcase the product line. Look at our craftsmanship. Your wife could look this confident if she buys 25 of these. The nakedness bothered colonial archaeologists so much. They couldn't decide if it was scandalous, primitive, religious, or artistic. Modern scholars are like, it's art, she's bronze, get over it. But the pearl clutching in early excavation reports is hilarious. Descriptions carefully avoid saying naked and instead use unclothed or without garments, as if euphemisms make it less obvious that she's not wearing pants. Her hair is styled, gathered in a bun with a detailed pattern that suggests braiding or decorative treatment. Someone cared how her hair looked. This wasn't a rough sketch in bronze. It was a carefully planned sculpture where hairstyle mattered. That level of detail suggests portraiture or, at the very least, a specific aesthetic standard, rather than a generic exotic dancer stereotype. The pose, hand on hip, weight shifted, is called contrapposto in classical art, a technique that creates dynamic realism by unbalancing the figure. Greek sculptors invented it in the 5th century BCE, and art historians made a big deal about how revolutionary it was. Except this girl is doing it 2,000 years earlier, and nobody gives the Indus Valley credit for figuring out that standing naturally looks better than standing like a board. Eurocentrism is showing like a slip below a hemline. Modern Indian and Pakistani scholars have reclaimed her as a symbol of ancient South Asian artistic achievement, and she appears on postage stamps, in textbooks, and on currency. She's become a nationalist iconography, which is its own peculiar fate for a tiny bronze girl who was perhaps just someone's art project 4,500 years ago. You turn from the dancing girl and come face to face with possibly the most misleadingly named artifact in archaeological history, the Priest King. Except he's probably not a priest, and definitely not a king, and might not even be a he depending on which iconoclastic scholar you're buying drinks for. But the name stuck like gum on a shoe, and now we're all trapped calling the steatite sculpture something that's almost certainly wrong because British archaeologists in the 1920s took one look at a bearded guy with a headband and invented an entire theocratic power structure to match their expectations. It's like naming your goldfish Emperor Napoleon and then writing a biography about his military campaigns. The label doesn't make it accurate. Still, good luck getting anyone to call him Gerald now. The sculpture is small, just under 7 inches tall, and carved from steatite, initially inlaid with red paste in the trefoil patterns that decorate his robe. He's bearded, solemn, wearing a headband with a circular ornament in the center, eyes half closed in what might be meditation or might be the sculptural equivalent of resting face. His robe passes over his left shoulder, leaving the right bare, which immediately makes archaeologists think of a priestly garment, because, apparently, that's the only context they can imagine for decorative clothing. The mainstream historical fact is that this sculpture was discovered in the lower town of Mohenjo-Daro in 1927, based purely on vibes and colonial assumptions about how ancient civilizations functioned. It was dubbed the Priest King within weeks of its discovery. No tomb, no temple context, no inscription saying, "This is definitely our religious and political leader." Just a well-carved dude and a bunch of British dudes projecting hierarchical power structures onto him. John Marshall, yes, the same individual who determined the dancing girl was indeed dancing, examined the sculpture and concluded that Mohenjo-Daro must have been ruled by priest kings, a theocratic system in which religious and political authority merged in one bearded figure. Why? Because Mesopotamia had priest kings. Because Egypt had god kings. Because every Bronze Age civilization the British had studied so far had some version of divine monarchy, and the idea that the Indus Valley might operate differently was apparently too cognitively challenging. It's like assuming every restaurant serves pizza just because the first 3 you visited were Italian. Marshall wrote extensively about the priestly demeanor and regal bearing of the sculpture, and you can practically hear him creating a whole governmental system based on one guy's facial expression. Here's your quirky tidbit that should make you doubt everything. The sculpture was found in a normal residential area, not a palace or temple. It was just in a house. Imagine if 4,000 years from now, archaeologists discover a bust of Julius Caesar in someone's living room and conclude that person was definitely a Roman emperor. Look at the laurel wreath, the authoritative expression. Clearly, this dwelling belonged to Emperor Steve. That's basically what happened here. The priest king could be a portrait of an actual leader, a religious figure, someone's truly impressive ancestor, or a decorative object purchased at the ancient equivalent of home goods. We don't know. You lean closer, and the craftsmanship is undeniable. The beard is rendered with individual hatched lines suggesting hair texture. The eyes are slightly downcast, creating a mood of introspection. The trefoil patterns on the robe are precise, repetitive, clearly significant, but maddeningly unexplained. Some scholars think the trefoils represent clover or flowers with religious symbolism. Others believe they are purely decorative. One fringe paper suggested they're symbols of authority, like Bronze Age military ribbons, which is almost creative enough to respect, except there's zero evidence. The headband with its central ornament has sparked its own subset of arguments. Is it a crown? A religious jaband? A fashion accessory that everyone wore, and we're making it way deeper than it is? The ornament resembles a circular boss, possibly representing the sun, a divine eye, or a particularly popular jewelry trend. Historians still argue whether this indicates religious significance or whether we're reading ceremonial importance into what might have been everyday formal wear. It's like finding a photo of someone in a tuxedo and concluding they must be royalty because the outfit looks fancy. The half-closed eyes are the most overinterpreted feature. Marshall thought they indicated meditation or spiritual trance. Later scholars suggested it was a stylistic choice to convey wisdom or inner focus. Some think it's just how this particular artist liked to carve eyes. Check out other Indus sculptures. and you'll see similar half-lidded gazes, possibly an artistic convention or a technical limitation of carving tiny eyeballs in stone. We've built entire theories of Indus spirituality on whether this guy looks sleepy or enlightened, and honestly, both interpretations are equally unsupported. The robe itself, bare right shoulder, fabric draped over the left, resembles clothing styles in later South Asian religious traditions, which is tantalizing but proves nothing. Clothing styles persist across millennia, but they also evolve, borrow elements from one another, and take on different meanings in various contexts. Saying, "This looks like later Buddhist monk robes, so he must be a priest," is like saying, "This guy's wearing jeans, so he must be a cowboy." It's a logical leap across a canyon of assumptions. Modern scholars are increasingly uncomfortable with the priest-king label. Some call him male bust, which is accurate but boring. Others use bearded man, which is descriptive and also dull. A few opt for seated figure in patterned robe, which is so boring that it ultimately becomes amusing. However, nobody has successfully unseated priest-king from widespread usage because it's catchy and evokes a specific image. Academic papers can't compete with a name that sounds like a D&D character class. The sculpture has become a national symbol for both India and Pakistan. He appears in textbooks, museums, tourist materials, representing ancient South Asian civilization, which is fine except he's representing a political structure we invented for him, a role he might never have held, a hierarchy that might not have existed. Its symbolism is built on speculation, founded on colonial assumptions, and based on a single carved rock. You leave the priest-king to his identity crisis and walk straight into the most overanalyzed swimming pool in human history. The Great Bath of Mohenjo-Daro stretches before you. 40 feet long, 23 feet wide, 8 feet deep. A massive rectangular tank sunk into the ground, lined with fitted bricks so precisely placed you couldn't slip a credit card between them. Waterproofed with bitumen, natural tar, to seal the gaps, fed by a well on one end and drained by a corbelled outlet on the other. It's magnificent. It's mysterious. It's been called everything from a sacred baptismal font to an ancient YMCA to a really expensive flex by city planners with too much budget. Archaeologists have been debating its purpose since 1926, and the debate has generated more academic papers than the bath has held gallons of water, which is saying something, considering the structure could host a serious pool party. The mainstream historical fact is that the Great Bath is one of the earliest public water structures in the world, built around 2500 BCE on the citadel mound of Mohenjo-Daro, surrounded by what appear to be essential buildings. However, nobody can agree on what made them necessary. The construction is insane, each brick perfectly fired, laid in precise courses. The floor is slightly sloped toward the drain, so water doesn't pool in corners and become contaminated. The bitumen waterproofing is layered between brick courses, essentially a Bronze Age sealant imported from natural seeps, probably hundreds of miles away. Someone wanted this bath to work, to last, to not leak into the foundation and undermine the whole structure. The engineering alone suggests that this wasn't a casual project. It was significant, expensive, and built to serve an important function that we're now guessing at, like it's charades night at the archaeology department. You walk down the brick steps. There are staircases on both the north and south ends, wide enough for people to descend side by side, and your feet land where thousands of ancient feet landed, wearing away the brick edges just slightly over centuries of use. The stairs are shallow, easy to navigate even when wet, and designed for safety in a way that suggests frequent traffic. This wasn't a visit once in your lifetime sacred site. People were coming here regularly, enough to wear paths into the literal stone. The early interpretation was a pure Victorian projection. It was obviously a ritual bath for religious purification. Why? Because later South Asian religions have ritual bathing. Hinduism, Jainism, Buddhism all emphasize water's purifying properties. And because British archaeologists couldn't imagine Bronze Age people building a giant bath to get clean or cool off, it had to be sacred, ceremonial, laden with spiritual significance. The idea that people living in a climate that reaches 120 degrees Fahrenheit might want to submerge themselves in cool water for purely practical reasons, such as, "Oh God, I'm dying of heat," was apparently too simple. Everything had to mean something deep, Here's your quirky tidbit that perfectly captures the speculation. Some scholars have proposed the Great Bath was used for initiating priests into religious mysteries, with the surrounding rooms serving as changing chambers or meditation cells. The evidence for this? The rooms exist. That's it. They're arranged around the bath. They have doorways and some have small platforms that might be benches. From this, we've constructed an entire ritual complex with initiation ceremonies, hierarchical access, and secret rites. It's like finding a locker room next to a pool and concluding it must be the headquarters of an ancient water cult. Maybe it was. Perhaps it's just where people stored their towels. You dip your hand into the imaginary water. The bath is empty now, has been for millennia, just dry brick and tourist footprints. But you imagine it full, the surface reflecting sky, the water cool and still in the morning before everyone arrived. How did they use it? Did people swim? Float? Just stand waist deep and gossip? Were there rules, attendance, or fees for entry? The structure could easily accommodate 50+ people at once if they were cozy about it. Fewer if everyone wanted personal space. The inlet is a well located on the western side, likely equipped with a pulley system to draw water up and channel it into the bath. The outlet is a corbelled drain on the southern corner, corbelled meaning the bricks step inward gradually to create a covered channel, a technique similar to their street drains but on a larger scale, designed to handle a significant water volume. The drain empties into the city's primary drainage system, which means that when they drained the bath, thousands of gallons rushed through the municipal sewers in what must have been a theatrical event for anyone downstream. Why is the street drain overflowing? Oh, they're cleaning the Great Bath again. Third time this month. Historians continue to debate whether this was a religious, recreational, or administrative activity. The religious camp highlights the careful construction, prominent location, and its presence in later traditions. The recreational camp notes that it's literally a giant pool and people like pools. Sometimes a bath is just a bath. The administrative weirdos suggest it was for water storage or firefighting, which seems like building a cathedral to store mops. But okay, let's pretend that's equally likely. Some researchers propose that it was multi-use. For religious ceremonies on special occasions, for public bathing the rest of the time, and possibly even for laundry or textile soaking for industrial purposes. This all-of-the-above theory is academically cowardly, but it is probably closest to the truth. Humans are great at repurposing spaces. Your dining table is also your WFH desk, your dumping ground for mail, and occasionally a laptop stand during Zoom calls. Why couldn't the Great Bath serve multiple functions? The surrounding structures include a large hall, several smaller rooms, and a well-constructed colonnade. Early excavators referred to it as a college of priests because, apparently, every building complex requires a religious label, but the rooms don't contain obvious religious paraphernalia. They're rooms, change areas, maybe administrative offices. May's housing maintenance staff had to keep the bath clean, the drains clear, and the water fresh. You climb out of the Great Bath, water dripping from your skin, and when you look around, you realize something deeply unsettling. This entire magnificent city, with its genius sewers, precision brickwork, and bathing complexes that shame modernity, it's empty. Not tourist empty or pandemic empty, but abandoned for 4,000 years empty, left to crumble into dust while the people who built it vanished so entirely that we're still arguing about where they went. Around 1900 BCE, possibly earlier, the Indus Valley Civilization began to decline. It wasn't a dramatic explosion or invasion, more like a slow, grinding collapse, where cities emptied, trade networks dissolved, and an entire sophisticated urban culture came to a sudden end. And the worst part? We can't agree on what killed it. Climate apocalypse, economic collapse, plague, invasion. All of the above in a Bronze Age nightmare combo. Pick your catastrophe. Someone's written a dissertation defending it. The mainstream historical fact is that by 1300 BCE, the major Indus cities were abandoned. Writing had disappeared, urban life had given way to rural settlements, and the cultural continuity that had lasted 1,000 years was shattered. This wasn't a quick invasion and massacre situation. Archaeological evidence shows a gradual decline over centuries, with populations shrinking, construction quality dropping, and the slow-motion death of a civilization watching itself fail. apparently unable or unwilling to stop it. Imagine watching your city deteriorate block by block, with infrastructure crumbling, people leaving, and jobs disappearing, and you're still there, sweeping your front step, as if maybe if you keep maintaining your little corner, everything will be fine. Spoiler, it wasn't fine. You stand in the upper layers of Mohenjo-Daro, the final occupation levels, and the difference is stark. The lower, earlier levels are pristine, with perfect brick alignment, proper drainage, and buildings constructed according to standardized plans. Up here, in the late period, the construction is sloppy. Bricks are reused from demolished buildings, walls are crooked, drains are broken and not repaired. Rooms are subdivided awkwardly, like the architectural equivalent of a college apartment where someone hung a bedsheet to create a bedroom. The city was dying, and the people still living there were doing it poorly, clinging to the ruins of something greater that they either couldn't maintain or didn't care to. The climate theories are heavy and depressing. Around 2000 to 1900 BCE, the monsoon patterns shifted, paleoclimate data from ocean sediments, lake cores, and stalagmites. Yes, cave formations reveal ancient weather, indicate that the monsoons weakened, resulting in decreased rainfall. The life-sustaining rains that fed agriculture diminished. Crops failed. Rivers shrank. The whole ecological basis of the Indus civilization, reliable water, predictable floods, agricultural surplus, became unreliable. It's the Bronze Age equivalent of your entire economy being based on a resource that's slowly disappearing, and you can't just pivot to something else because you've built everything around it. Worse, the Sarasvati River, a significant waterway that supported massive population centers in the eastern Indus region, changed course or dried up entirely. We know it existed. Satellite imagery shows the dry river bed, a paleo channel cutting across what's now Rajasthan and Haryana. And archaeological sites line its ancient banks like abandoned river towns in the American Dust Bowl. Historians still argue whether the Sarasvati dried up due to tectonic shifts that diverted its tributaries, or climate change that reduced its flow, or both in a 1-2 punch of environmental catastrophe. The debate gets spicy because the Sarasvati is mentioned in ancient Vedic texts as a mighty river, and proving or disproving its existence becomes entangled with nationalist claims about Indian history, which turns peer-reviewed research into a minefield of political agendas. Here's your quirky tidbit, which is equal parts fascinating and horrifying. Some settlements show evidence of people desperately trying to maintain their old way of life as everything fell apart. At Kalibangan, a city located on the Sarasvati, the final occupation layers reveal the continuation of ritual fire altars and urban planning. Even as the population declined and the river dried up, they continued to perform the rituals, adhering to the old patterns, probably hoping that if they just did everything right, the rains would return, the river would flow, and everything would return to normal. Didn't. The city was abandoned. The altars went cold. It's the Bronze Age version of rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic, except the Titanic is your entire civilization and there are no lifeboats. You walk through what used to be a street, now filled with wind-blown sand and pottery shards, and you can feel the desperation in the archaeological layers. The drainage systems, those beautiful functional drains that were the Indus Valley's flex, are clogged, broken, filled with debris. Nobody's maintaining them. The municipal infrastructure that required collective effort and centralized coordination has collapsed because either the central authority dissolved or everyone's too busy trying not to starve to care about sewage management. When the toilets stop working, you know society is in trouble. Trade goods disappear from the archaeological record in the late period. The exotic materials that flowed through Indus ports, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, copper from Oman, gold from Karnataka, they dry up. The seals with their undeciphered script, used for marking trade goods, vanish almost entirely after 1900 BCE. The entire commercial network that connected the Indus Valley to Mesopotamia, the Persian Gulf, and Central Asia, it collapsed. Perhaps because the cities had nothing to trade, or because the trade routes themselves had become unsafe or unviable, or probably because everyone was dealing with their own climate and political disasters, making international commerce a luxury that nobody could afford. Some scholars propose that invasion by Aryans, Indo-European speakers migrating from the northwest, destroyed the Indus cities. This theory dominated for decades, supported by shaky evidence like finding skeletons in massacre positions at Mohenjo-Daro. Modern reanalysis proved those skeletons were from different time periods, buried by flooding, not slaughtered in a military assault. The invasion theory is now mostly debunked, relegated to the same academic garbage heap as phrenology and the dancing girl's presumed profession. However, it persists in popular imagination and nationalist rhetoric because some people genuinely want ancient history to be a story of invasions and conquests rather than a slow environmental and economic collapse. You're picking through the ruins of collapsed trade networks when something catches your eye. A seal, partially buried in dust, and on it is an animal that shouldn't exist. One horn, bovine body, possibly a weird neck situation, standing in front of what might be a feeding trough or might be abstract religious symbolism or might be the Indus equivalent of a corporate logo. It's a unicorn. Except it's not, because unicorns aren't real. However, it is because this image definitely features one horn, and it appears on approximately 60% of all Indus seals, making it the single most common artistic motif of the entire civilization. Imagine if, for 1,000 years from now, archaeologists discovered the ruins of our society and found that 60% of all our official documents featured a cartoon mouse with oversized ears. They would then have to deduce what that meant about our religion, economy, and political structure. That's where we are with the unicorn seals, except worse because at least we could Google Mickey Mouse. And the unicorn mystery has no search engine. The mainstream historical fact is that these square steatite seals with the unicorn motif were mass-produced throughout the Indus Valley, used for stamping clay tags on trade goods, found from Afghanistan to Gujarat, representing standardized imagery across an area the size of Western Europe. Their administrative tools, basically Bronze Age barcodes, and the unicorn was clearly significant, official, recognizable, meaningful. But what it meant, what animal it represents, why it was chosen as the civilization's brand identity, nobody knows. The debates have gotten progressively more unhinged over the past century. You hold a seal up to the light, and the carving is exquisite. The animal's body is powerful, muscular, definitely based on something real. The proportions are too confident, too anatomically grounded to be pure fantasy. The single horn curves slightly, emerges from the center of the forehead, and looks deliberate and prominent. Above the animal is the script, those maddening, undeciphered symbols that probably identify the owner or the goods or some bureaucratic notation we'll never understand. Below the animal is the feeding trough, ritual object, or mystery box, sometimes with abstract symbols, sometimes plain. The debates about identification are wild. Some scholars insist it's a bull shown in profile, and the second horn is hidden behind the first because Bronze Age artists used composite perspectives and didn't do 3D rendering. This is possible. It's also convenient and unprovable. You can't argue with the evidence is hidden from this angle. It's the archaeological equivalent of my girlfriend lives in Canada. You wouldn't know her. The bull theory is popular because bulls appear on other seals in clear two-horned glory, and bulls were economically and religiously significant across ancient cultures. So making the unicorn a bull fits expectations. Other researchers claim it's an Indian rhinoceros shown in profile, and the horn is actually the rhino's single nasal horn, artistically exaggerated for symbolism. Rhinos definitely existed in the Indus region. We have rhino bones, rhino imagery on other artifacts, and modern rhino populations barely surviving in South Asia. The problem? The body proportions don't match. Rhinos are tank-shaped, low-slung, with thick legs and massive shoulders. The unicorn seal animals are slender, graceful, and more akin to an antelope than a prehistoric armored vehicle. Historians still argue whether the artists were stylizing reality beyond recognition or whether we're forcing a rhino identification onto something else entirely because we're uncomfortable admitting we don't know. Here's your quirky tidbit that reveals how desperate this gets. One scholar proposed that the unicorn is a composite creature, intentionally mythological, representing multiple animals merged into one symbolic being that embodies cosmic or religious concepts. Evidence? The fact that it doesn't match any single real animal. This is circular reasoning dressed in academic language. It's not real because it doesn't look real. But the paper was published, cited, and now lives forever in the literature as a theory, haunting graduate students who must address it in footnotes. A particularly spicy subset argues that it's an aurochs, the wild ancestor of modern cattle, or some extinct bovine for which we lack good skeletal references, depicted with artistic license that merges the horns visually. This is frustratingly plausible and frustratingly unprovable. There may be a local animal that looked similar and went extinct before it could be catalogued. Perhaps the artists were drawing from a cultural memory of an animal that had vanished centuries before they began carving. Or maybe, and this is the option that makes archaeologists scratch their heads, it's been obvious the whole time and we're just looking at it wrong. You flip through dozens of seal impressions, the negative images stamped into clay, and the unicorn appears again and again and again. Different carving hands, slight style variations, but the same basic image. One-horned creature, standardized pose, ritual object or feeding trough, script above. The consistency screams official, governmental, and regulated. You couldn't just carve whatever you wanted on your trade seal. There were standards, conventions, and probably workshops that specialized in seal production and followed strict templates. The ritual object below the unicorn drives its own sub-debate. Some think it's a brazier for burning incense or offerings. Others say feeding trough, connecting the image to animal husbandry and economic wealth. A few propose that it's an entirely abstract symbol, a form of religious iconography that has nothing to do with feeding or burning anything. One particularly creative paper suggested it's a representation of a city gate or architectural element, making the whole seal a message about urban identity. The author presented zero evidence beyond "it could be, though," which is peer review working precisely as intended or completely broken, depending on your perspective. The unicorn's posture is interesting, usually standing, sometimes with one foreleg raised like it's mid-step or pawing the ground. The tail varies. Sometimes it hangs, sometimes it is curved, and sometimes it is barely visible. The attention to detail in musculature, leg joints, and body proportion suggests the carvers knew this animal, had observed it, and weren't just copying copies of copies. But if they knew it, why can't we identify it? You set down the unicorn seal and stand up, ready to find the palace where these official seals were authorized, the temple where the unicorn was worshipped, the throne room where the king stamped his approval on trade regulations. You walk through Mohenjo-Daro looking for the power center, the governmental heart, the buildings that scream, important people made important decisions here. You walk and walk and walk through grid-plan streets and residential blocks and workshop areas, and slowly, like a horror movie where the protagonist realizes the call is coming from inside the house, you understand there isn't one. No palace, no temple, no massive ziggurat or pyramid or fortress or any of the architectural ego-stroking that defines literally every other Bronze Age civilization. The Indus Valley looked at monumental religious and political architecture and said, "Nah, we're good." And modern archaeologists have been having a collective breakdown about it ever since. The mainstream historical fact is that despite over a century of excavation at multiple major Indus sites, no one has definitively identified a palace, temple, or monumental religious structure. There are large buildings, sure, great halls, granaries probably, platforms, but nothing that screams, "King lives here," or "Worship the gods in this expensive building we built to prove our piety." In Egypt, you can't swing a cat without hitting a temple to Ra or Osiris or someone's dead pharaoh. Mesopotamia has ziggurats visible from space, literal stairways to heaven built to facilitate communication between gods and humans. The Indus Valley has really nice urban planning and a concerning number of bathrooms. It's like showing up to a potluck where everyone brought elaborate cakes and you brought vegetable trays. Functional? Yes. Impressive in the expected way? Absolutely not. You stand in the middle of what early excavators called the citadel at Mohenjo-Daro, the raised western mound where the Great Bath sits, and you feel the desperation of archaeologists trying to impose familiar categories. They called it a citadel because it's elevated and has large buildings, but there are no fortifications, no armories, no military architecture. They called buildings granaries because they're big with thick walls, but grain analysis is inconclusive, and some might be warehouses or meeting halls. The Great Bath got labeled ritual through sheer vibes. Everything is named based on what it should be according to other civilizations, not based on actual evidence of function. Here's your quirky tidbit that perfectly captures the chaos. At Harappa, there's a structure with a series of circular brick platforms that early excavators called a granary, for reasons that now seem entirely arbitrary. Later reanalysis suggested it might have been used as a floor for threshing grain, as platforms for workers, as bases for storing goods, or literally anything else that involved circles and bricks. One particularly frustrated scholar published a paper essentially titled, We have no idea what this building was for. I'm paraphrasing, but the abstract's vibe was pure defeat. The structure is still in guidebooks as the granary, because once you name something, the name sticks like a curse, accurate or not. The absence of temples is bonkers when you consider the context. The Sumerians built ziggurats that dominated their city skylines. The ziggurat of Ur is still partially standing 4,000 years later, a massive testament to the fact that our God is important and also we have excellent bricklayers. The Egyptians built temple complexes at Karnak that took centuries to construct and employed thousands of workers. These weren't subtle societies. They advertised their religious devotion through architecture, which said, "We love our gods so much we bankrupted the treasury proving it." The Indus Valley? Radio silence. If they had temples, they were built from materials that completely disintegrated, located in areas that we haven't excavated yet, which is unlikely after 100 plus years, or they worshipped in ways that didn't require monumental buildings, which is possible but breaks all our Bronze Age templates. Some scholars propose that the Indus religion was household-based, with domestic shrines, personal devotion, and rituals conducted in homes rather than centralized temples. Evidence? Figurines found in houses that might represent deities, fire altars in some residential contexts, and bathing areas that could serve as ritual purification spots. This is plausible. It's also the archaeological equivalent of the absence of evidence is evidence of absence, which is philosophically murky and makes for terrible conference presentations. Historians still debate whether the absence of palaces indicates that the Indus Valley was genuinely egalitarian, run by councils or guilds, without kings or centralized autocracy, or whether elite residences have yet to be discovered. The egalitarian camp points to the uniform house sizes. Yes, some are bigger, but not significantly so, the lack of monumental tombs, and the absence of royal propaganda art. The "we haven't found it yet" camp notes that only a tiny percentage of any Indus site has been excavated. Mohenjo-Daro is perhaps 10% uncovered, and Harappa is similar. Therefore, the palace may be located under the unexcavated sections or under modern cities built on top, remaining inaccessible forever beneath Karachi's sprawl. The debate gets heated because it touches modern politics. If the Indus Valley was egalitarian, that's a powerful counter-narrative to humans naturally organize into hierarchies with kings and slaves. It suggests that alternative social organizations were possible, sustainable, and prosperous for 1,000 years. Conservative scholars hate this because it challenges assumptions about power being centralized and necessary. Progressive scholars love it because it offers ancient evidence for more equitable societies. Both sides are potentially letting ideology drive interpretation, and the actual Harappans are long dead. They can't weigh in on whether they describe their society as egalitarian or "we have leaders," but they're not building narcissistic monuments about it. You walk through residential areas, and honestly, the houses are remarkably similar. Courtyard design, ground floor with rooms arranged around an open space, stairs to a second floor, long rotted away, bathroom with toilet and drainage, sometimes a well. Richer houses are bigger, have more rooms, and fancier decorative elements. But there's no mansion district, no palace quarter, no gated community where the elite live behind walls. It's just neighborhoods like a well-planned suburb designed by someone who actually gave a shit about livability. You leave the palace-less, temple-less mystery behind and follow a sound rhythmic, grinding, monotonous, until you arrive at a workshop where the real work of the Indus Valley happened. Not grand political decisions or religious ceremonies, but the utterly mundane, back-breaking, finger-destroying labor of bead manufacturing. The room smells like stone dust and sweat. The floor is covered in carnelian chips and drill debris, and hunched over workstations are people, probably including children, because child labor is the dark secret of every pre-modern economy. Drilling holes through semi-precious stones one agonizing rotation at a time. This is where the Indus Valley's famous trade goods originated. Not from divine inspiration or royal decree, but from production lines where human beings sacrificed their hands and eyesight to create tiny decorative objects that wealthy people across the Bronze Age world purchased to demonstrate their trade connections and disposable income. The mainstream historical fact is that the Indus Valley Civilization operated sophisticated craft production workshops specializing in beadmaking, shellworking, metalsmithing, and textile production, with evidence of standardized techniques, specialized tools, and mass production on a scale that suggests an organized industry rather than individual artisans working independently. At Chanhudaro and Lathal, archaeologists found entire workshop districts, areas zoned for manufacturing, with debris piles, tool caches, and half-finished products that reveal the production process in uncomfortable detail. These weren't hobbyists making beads for fun. These were industrial operations churning out trade goods by the thousands, and someone was profiting off this labor, even if we can't identify exactly who. You pick up a carnelian bead, deep red, translucent, perfectly shaped and polished, with a hole drilled through the center so precise it's like someone used a laser instead of Bronze Age technology. The hole is perfectly straight with a consistent diameter, and the entry and exit points are smooth. Now you look at the pile of failed beads next to it. Cracked stones where the drill slipped, uneven holes that wandered off course, beads that shattered during polishing. For every perfect bead, there are probably 10 failures, 10 wasted hours of labor, 10 tiny monuments to how hard it is to drill carnelian without modern equipment. Here's the process that will make you grateful for your terrible job. First, you source the carnelian, a semi-precious stone that's extremely hard, rating 6.5 to 7 on the Mohs scale, more durable than steel, only scratchable by quartz or harder materials. The Indus Valley imported it from deposits in Gujarat and Maharashtra, hundreds of miles away, making it an investment before anyone had even touched a tool. Then you heat treat the raw stone, yes, heat treat, like you're tempering steel, by burying it in fire pits to enhance the color, deepen the red, make it more attractive. This is chemistry without chemistry knowledge, learned through trial and error over generations, and if you get it wrong, the stone cracks, and you've wasted expensive raw material. Next, shaping. You grind the heated stone against a more rigid abrasive surface, probably quartzite or another hard stone. Rotating it, applying pressure, wearing it down millimeter by millimeter until you achieve the desired bead shape. This takes hours per bead. Your fingers cramp. Stone dust fills your lungs. Silicosis is the ancient craftworker's occupational hazard, and nobody's invented respirators or workplace safety regulations. You breathe stone particles and hope you die of something else first. Then comes drilling, and this is where it gets properly dystopian. The drill is a bow drill, a stick with a stone or metal bit on the end, spun by moving a bow back and forth like you're playing the world's most tedious violin. The bit is probably made of jasper or agate, or later, bronze, and you need a constant abrasive paste, water mixed with quartz sand, to help the bit cut through the carnelian. You sit there, hunched over, spinning the drill and applying downward pressure for hours, drilling a hole maybe 2 millimeters wide through a bead that's 1 centimeter long. Your shoulders burn. Your wrists develop repetitive strain injuries that won't be named for another 4,500 years. If you're a child, and excavations of craft areas suggest children absolutely work these jobs because their small hands were better for detail work, your growing bones are deforming under the repetitive stress, your spine curving, your joints wearing down before you hit puberty. Here's your quirky tidbit that's actually horrifying. Skeletal analysis from some Indus sites shows arthritis patterns and bone deformations consistent with repetitive craft labor in individuals as young as 8 to 12 years old. Their wrist bones show stress markers, their vertebrae compression from hunched postures, and their finger joints early-onset arthritis from gripping tools. We have physical evidence of children's bodies being worn out by bead production, and there's no record of labor laws, workplace protections, or anyone saying, hey, maybe we shouldn't destroy kids' skeletal systems for jewelry. It's the ancient equivalent of Victorian chimney sweeps or modern fast fashion sweatshops, economically rational, morally bankrupt, and deeply embedded in the production system. Historians still debate whether the state organized craft production, independent guilds, or merchant families running what were essentially Bronze Age corporations. The standardization of techniques suggests centralized training or regulation. You can't have every workshop doing it differently and maintain quality control across a trade network spanning thousands of miles. But who regulated it? A government bureau of bead standards? Craft guilds with apprenticeship programs? Family businesses passing down techniques and exploiting their own children's labor? We don't know, and the absence of written records, or our inability to read them, means every theory is speculation dressed in academic citations. The workshop floors are covered in manufacturing debris. At Chanhudaro, excavators found thousands of unfinished beads, broken drills, stone saw fragments, and manufacturing waste in organized piles, suggesting that someone was managing the chaos. Likely a workshop supervisor who would have yelled at people when they broke expensive carnelian blanks. The waste layers are stratified. You can see production continuing over decades, technology improving slightly, techniques evolving, but the basic process staying brutally labor-intensive. Shell working was equally industrialized. Conch shells imported from the coast were cut into bangles using wire saws. Bronze wire pulled back and forth with abrasive paste, literally sawing through the shell. This process was so tedious that it made drilling carnelian look fun. The shell bangles were then polished, sometimes inlaid with other materials, and sold across the Indus trade network and beyond. Excavations in Mesopotamia have found Indus shell bangles, proving that Bronze Age global trade connected luxury consumers in Iraq with laborers who destroyed their hands in Indian workshops. You step away from the bead workshop, your imaginary lungs full of stone dust and existential dread about labor practices, and stumble into the least sexy but most revealing aspect of Indus Valley archaeology: teeth. Specifically, the chemical composition of tooth enamel, which sounds like the world's most boring graduate seminar but is actually archaeological snitching of the highest order. Because while the Indus people didn't leave written records we can read, didn't build temples to announce their beliefs, and didn't helpfully carve, we migrated here from X location in Y year on their tombstones, their teeth told on them. Isotope analysis of skeletal remains has completely rewritten our understanding of the Indus diet, migration, and population composition. It has happened so recently that textbooks are still catching up, and older scholars are having quiet meltdowns about their life's work being contradicted by the findings of chemistry. The mainstream historical fact is that stable isotope analysis, measuring ratios of carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, and strontium isotopes in tooth enamel and bone, can reveal what people ate, where they grew up, and whether they migrated during their lifetime, because different foods and water sources leave distinct chemical signatures in your body that persist long after you're dead. It's like your skeleton is a flight recorder documenting everywhere you've been and everything you've eaten, except instead of a black box, it's your molars. Instead of crash investigators, it's bioarchaeologists using mass spectrometers who are getting very excited about carbon-13 ratios. The technique has been applied to Indus Valley remains since the early 2000s, and the results have been chaos, the fun kind of chaos where every finding spawns 3 new debates. Someone's dissertation becomes obsolete before they defend it. You're holding a molar, hypothetically, because most museums frown on fondling their collections and imagining the lab process. First, someone drills a tiny sample from the tooth enamel, typically a few milligrams, which may feel sacrilegious but is necessary for scientific purposes. The sample gets cleaned, processed, and run through a mass spectrometer that measures isotope ratios with terrifying precision. The carbon isotope ratio, specifically delta-13C, delta carbon-13 for the nerds, reveals whether the person ate mainly C3 plants like wheat, rice, and most vegetables, or C4 plants like millet, sorghum, and certain tropical grasses. Different plants photosynthesize differently, leave different isotopic fingerprints, and your bones record your agricultural choices like a permanent food diary written in chemistry. Here's where it gets wild. Everyone assumed the Indus Valley ran on wheat and barley because those were the prestige crops in Mesopotamia and Egypt, and because early archaeologists found wheat and barley at Indus sites and concluded that's what everyone ate. Wrong. Wrong. Isotope analysis revealed that many Indus Valley populations were eating primarily millet, specifically sorghum and various millets, which are drought-resistant, fast-growing, nutritionally dense, and historically considered poor people food compared to wheat. The carbon signatures don't lie. A significant portion of the population, possibly the majority in some areas, were millet eaters, and this completely reshapes our understanding of Indus agriculture and economy. Why does this matter? Because millet agriculture is different from wheat agriculture. Different growing seasons, different water requirements, different labor patterns, different storage and processing. Suppose the Indus Valley was heavily millet-based, especially in later periods. In that case, it suggests adaptation to climate change, remember the weakening monsoon, as well as economic strategies we may not have recognized, and possibly class or ethnic divisions in food access. Perhaps elites consumed wheat, while the rest of the population ate millet. Perhaps different regions specialized in different crops and traded them. Possibly, millet became more critical as droughts increased and wheat became less reliable. Historians still debate whether millet dominance represents climate adaptation, cultural preference, or economic inequality, and the arguments become heated because food is always a political issue, then and now. Here's your quirky tidbit that made headlines. Isotope analysis of remains from Harappa revealed that some individuals grew up drinking water from completely different geological regions. Their strontium isotope ratios, which reflect local water sources and geology, don't match the Harappa area. They migrated there, possibly as children or young adults, from regions hundreds of kilometers away. Some came from the coast, others from inland areas, others from mountain regions. This is direct chemical evidence of population movement, immigration, trade-driven mobility, or possibly marriage patterns where people moved to join spouses' families. The Indus Valley wasn't an isolated, homogeneous population. It was cosmopolitan, mixing people from different regions, and we only discovered this by drilling teeth that have been dead for 4,000 years. You imagine the person whose tooth you're hypothetically holding. Maybe they grew up near the ocean, drinking coastal water with its distinctive strontium signature, eating fish and millet, and then sometime before their adult teeth fully formed, they moved to Harappa. Trade mission? Marriage? Family migration? We'll never know their story, but the chemistry documents the move with more certainty than any written record. Nitrogen isotopes, delta-1,5N, reveal protein sources. Higher nitrogen-15 ratios indicate marine protein or meat consumption. Lower ratios suggest vegetarian or primarily plant-based diets. Indus Valley samples show a considerable variation. Some individuals were eating significant amounts of animal protein, while others consumed almost none. This could indicate religious dietary restrictions, such as early vegetarianism, economic access to meat, or personal preference. One study found individuals buried in the same cemetery with wildly different nitrogen signatures, suggesting dietary diversity even within single communities. The oxygen isotopes, delta-180, in tooth enamel reflect the water you drank while your teeth were forming. Specifically, the seasonal variation in rainfall. Monsoon rain has different oxygen isotope ratios than winter rain or river water, and teeth record this in growth layers like tree rings. Researchers can literally see whether you were drinking monsoon water or water from dry season sources, which reveals seasonal migration patterns, access to water infrastructure, such as the Indus wells versus natural sources, and climate conditions during your childhood. It's creepy how much your teeth remember about you. Historians still argue whether isotopic diversity within Indus populations indicates immigration from outside the civilization, internal migration between cities, or just people moving around within a large, interconnected region. Some researchers see the chemical variation and conclude that the Indus Valley was a melting pot attracting people from across South Asia. Others argue that it's normal mobility within a large civilization, such as finding someone in ancient Rome who grew up in Roman Egypt, which doesn't mean immigration as much as movement within the same political/cultural sphere. You set down the tooth and pick up something even more invasive and controversial: DNA results. Ancient DNA extracted from skeletal remains, amplified, sequenced, analyzed, and published in papers that immediately triggered nationalist meltdowns, academic flame wars, and headlines like "Study Reveals Shocking Truth About Indus Valley Ancestry" that revealed absolutely nothing shocking to anyone who understands how human migration actually works. Because here's the thing about genetics. It's objective science that gets weaponized for subjective political agendas faster than you can say haplogroup. And the Indus Valley has become ground zero for battles over who gets to claim ancient heritage, what Indian means genetically, and whether 4,500-year-old bones support your modern political narrative. Spoiler. They don't, they're just bones. They don't care about your borders. The mainstream historical fact is that ancient DNA analysis of Indus Valley skeletal remains, published starting in 2018 to 2019, revealed genetic ancestry that doesn't neatly map onto modern ethnic or national categories, showing instead a complex mixture of populations that predates the categories we're trying to force them into. The individuals analyzed showed ancestry related to ancient Iranian farmers who migrated into South Asia during the Neolithic, indigenous South Asian hunter-gatherers, and, in later periods after the civilization's decline, genetic input from steppe pastoralists migrating from Central Asia. It's a process of migration, mixture, and population continuity happening simultaneously over millennia, and trying to summarize it as the Indus people were X ethnic group is like trying to describe ocean currents with a single arrow. You're not wrong exactly, but you're missing about 90% of what's actually happening. You stare at a genetic ancestry chart, one of those triangle plots that show individual samples positioned based on their genetic similarity to reference populations, and it looks like someone threw darts at a map and then drew lines between them. Some Indus individuals cluster closer to ancient Iranian-related ancestry, others show more South Asian hunter-gatherer heritage, and a few are basically 50-50 mixtures. What this tells us is that the Indus Valley population was genetically diverse, drawing from multiple ancestral source populations, mixing over time, and absolutely refusing to be a simple, pure, unmixed population that modern nationalists could claim as our ancestors, nobody else's. Here's the result that caused chaos. The Indus Valley individuals analyzed did not show significant steppe pastoralist ancestry, which appears in South Asian populations only after the Indus cities declined. This is huge because for decades, people argued about whether Indo-European language speakers, the Aryans of outdated and racist terminology, invaded and destroyed the Indus civilization. The genetics say nope, the steppe ancestry arrives later after urban decline and mixes with Indus descendant populations gradually, not in a violent replacement event. It's migration and mixture, not invasion and genocide. This should have settled the debate. Instead, it spawned new debates about what Aryan means, whether language and genetics correlate, and how to reconcile ancient DNA with modern politics. Here's your quirky tidbit that's actually depressing. When the first major Indus Valley ancient DNA paper was published in 2018, the comment sections of news articles and social media exploded with people arguing about whether the results proved Indians were indigenous or invaders, whether Pakistan or India had better claim to Indus heritage, whether this validated or disproved Hindu nationalist narratives. Scientists were like, we sequenced some DNA, here's what it shows about population history. And the internet was like, but does it prove my political beliefs? The disconnect between what genetics actually reveals, a complicated population history with migration and mixture, and what people wanted to reveal, simple narratives supporting modern identities, is a chasm that could drop the entire field of archaeogenetics into. Historians still debate whether genetic data should be used to interpret cultural and linguistic change, as genes, language, and culture don't necessarily evolve in tandem. You can adopt a new language without genetic replacement. See, most of Latin America speaking Spanish despite minimal Iberian genetic ancestry in indigenous populations. You can maintain genetic continuity while completely changing culture. See, modern Greeks versus ancient Greeks, genetic continuity, completely different culture, language, and religion. Using DNA to prove that a particular modern group is the true descendant of an ancient civilization is scientifically illiterate, but that doesn't stop people from attempting to do so. The Indus Valley descendant populations, the people who lived in the same region after the cities collapsed, show genetic continuity with Indus individuals, meaning the civilization didn't vanish because everyone died or migrated away. They stayed. They just stopped living in cities, stopped writing, or we stopped finding evidence of writing, transitioned to rural villages, and mixed with incoming populations from the steppes and elsewhere. The culture transformed, the genetics mixed, and trying to separate original Indus people from later migrants in modern South Asian populations is impossible because they've been blending for 4,000 years. Every modern South Asian person with ancestry in the region likely has some genetic inheritance from Indus populations, mixed with contributions from a dozen other ancestral groups. It's a genetic palimpsest, and trying to claim exclusive heritage is like arguing you own a soup because your ancestor contributed one ingredient. The political stakes are absurd. Hindu nationalists want evidence that Vedic culture and the Indus civilization were the same, proving an unbroken indigenous heritage without outside influence. Pakistani nationalists wish for the Indus Valley to be foundational to Pakistani identity, separate from Indian claims. Both want genetic proof that ancient people supported modern borders and identities, which is like asking your dog's DNA test to confirm your political party affiliation. Genetics doesn't work that way. Borders are recent inventions. Ancient people moved, mixed, and didn't organize their breeding patterns around making your 21st century nationalist argument easier. Some samples came from a site called Rakhigarhi, now located in Haryana, India, which triggered an additional dispute because the site is within India's borders. Still, the individuals are genetically ancestral to populations across South Asia, so who gets to claim them? The answer is it's complicated, and maybe we should stop thinking about ancient people as validators of modern political boundaries. But that's not a satisfying answer if you're trying to prove your nation has an exclusive claim to a 5,000-year heritage. You look at the bones, the actual physical remains that provided the DNA, and they're just people. They lived, ate millet or wheat, moved around or stayed put, had kids who eventually contributed genetic material to millions of modern descendants scattered across South Asia and beyond. They didn't know they'd become political footballs. They were trying to survive in a civilization that was slowly collapsing, making the best decisions they could with the information available to them, which is the most relatable aspect about them. You step back from the bones, the teeth, the seals, the toilets, the collapsed cities, and the academic warfare, and you realize you've just walked through 4,500 years of human history that refuses to simplify. The Indus Valley Civilization was sophisticated and mysterious, yet simultaneously egalitarian and exploitative, peaceful and violent, indigenous and cosmopolitan all at once, because humans are complex and civilizations are just humans on a larger scale. They built incredible sewers and employed child labor. They traded across continents and couldn't stop the climate from destroying their agricultural base. They created art we can't interpret and urban planning that puts modernity to shame. And the biggest mystery isn't the undeciphered script or the missing temples or the unicorn seals. It's that we keep trying to make them fit our expectations, our categories, our political needs, when they existed on their own terms in a world we can barely reconstruct. Every answer spawns 3 new questions. Every excavation reveals how much we don't know. The Indus Valley Civilization is a 1,000-year reminder that the past is foreign territory, and we're tourists with bad maps and worse translation apps, stumbling around trying to make sense of a place that doesn't owe us clarity. You walk away from Mohenjo-Daro as the sun sets, the ruins glowing amber in the failing light, and somewhere beneath the unexcavated mounds, beneath the modern cities, beneath the political arguments and academic debates, the actual Indus people rest, unbothered by our confusion, unconcerned with our categories, probably laughing at how we've spent a century arguing about their toilets. At least they had good toilets. That's more than most civilizations can say. And as you drift off tonight, processing everything you've just survived, the skull-fondling Victorians, the jar burials, the bone trauma, the weaponless cities, the superior plumbing, the undeciphered writing, the controversial 4-inch bronze girl, the misnamed priest king, the Great Bath identity crisis, the climate apocalypse, the unicorn seals that might be bulls, the missing palaces, the exploited beadworkers, the snitching teeth, and the DNA results that ruined everyone's political narratives. Just remember, somewhere in the archaeological record, there's a 4,500-year-old toe bone with a crush injury from someone dropping something heavy, and that person, hopping around swearing in a language we'll never understand, is more relatable than any king or priest we've invented. At least nobody asked you to drill carnelian beads until your fingers bled today. Probably. Sweet dreams. The unicorn is still judging you.